Well, welcome everybody. Tonight we're talking about an insider's guide to standing out to highly selective colleges. My name is Ann Dolin, and I will be your host this evening. Now, let me start out by asking the age of your student, if you don't mind. We're going to dig into the nitty-gritty with Kristen in just a second, but I'm curious, when will your child graduate from high school? If you could pop that in the chat, that would be amazing. Actually, don't pop that in the chat. Melissa's going to pull up a poll, and that will help us to see what grade your child's in. Melissa, can you help us with that? I don't see it. All right, let's forget the poll, and we're going to try something different. If you don't mind, go ahead and put in the chat the grade of your student will graduate. Okay, awesome. Thank you, everybody. Sorry for that little glitch. All right, so let's see what we have. We have a lot of 2024. So we've got 2025, 25, 24, 26, 27, 24, a sophomore, 24, 25, 25, 28. Awesome. All right. 24. And one parent even said in May. Okay, good. 28. So we've got parents of kids really along the spectrum, and that's awesome. I'm so glad you're all here tonight. We're going to make sure that this has a little bit of everybody. So whether your child is still in middle school, a freshman, a sophomore, a junior, we'll make sure that everything is covered. So I want you to join me in welcoming Kristin Landis this evening. Kristen is fantastic. You're going to love her. Kristen is a college consultant here with us at Educational Connections. She has a Bachelor of Science from the University of Richmond, and she actually has her law degree from Emory University in Atlanta. Kristen, for the last 11 years before coming to Educational Connections, she worked in admissions at University of Virginia, which is a highly selective school. And during that time, she evaluated over 10,000 applications, both in-state, out-of-state, and those of international candidates. So Kristen, welcome. I'm so glad that you're here this evening.
Thanks so much for having me, Ann. I'm so happy to be here.
Awesome. All right, so let's get started with the big question. What constitutes a highly selective college?
So that's like the buzzword. Everybody hears that, most competitive college, highly selective college. And a lot of people are like, well, what does that exactly mean? Well, it's a pretty simple definition. A highly selective school is determined by the percentage of students that are accepted from those that apply. So the lower the percentage that are accepted, the more selective the school. So what schools constitute that? Well, I'm sure comes to top of mind for most people are the Ivy Leagues, of which there are 8. Everybody can probably rattle them off on their fingers, those schools. But they also include other schools such as MIT, schools like Stanford. Stanford had the lowest acceptance rate this past year. University of Chicago, Johns Hopkins, Duke, other schools that people come top to mind. But there are other schools that are also fall into that, those smaller competitive liberal arts schools, of which Amherst, Williams, Swarthmore, those are some of those schools. And then there's another tier that's also put into this highly selective category. And those schools include UVA, Berkeley, Michigan, Notre Dame, BC. So what's interesting is then you say, okay, well, what exactly does that mean? So the acceptance rates for these schools in recent years are falling somewhere between 3 and 9%, which is really low. And that's why they are considered highly or the most selective schools.
Thank you so much for explaining that. Let's talk a little bit about what's changed in college admissions over the last few years. What have you seen as the biggest change?
Well, that's exactly what I was just alluding to, Ann, is exactly what's changed, is that for these schools, Ivy Leagues, maybe 15 years ago, you were seeing a 10% acceptance rate. Now they're all down into the 3 and 4%. Schools such as Duke and Johns Hopkins used to have a 21%. Now they're down in the 6%. And then that next tier, where used to be acceptance rates were in the 15 to 30%, you're seeing down near 10%. So this really significant decrease in school admissions. One example of this, which is just like mind-blowing, is Vanderbilt. had a 32% acceptance rate maybe 10 years ago, and now they're at 6%. So you see this really decrease in acceptances. And then you ask yourself, well, why? What has changed so much? And the answer to that is simply you're seeing that many more students apply to schools. And there's a number of reasons for that. You and I have talked about this at numerous webinars before, and that is that you're just seeing with the test optional landscape we've had in the last few years, students are casting wider nets. Whereas their testing scores before they thought were somewhat prohibitive for them to applying to higher reach schools for themselves, they're applying to those schools. You're also seeing with the pandemic that schools got very, very well versed in advertising themselves online, having virtual tours. Their promotional materials were better. The internet in general has just allowed students to not have to go to a university anymore to visit it. I mean, that's obviously the best thing to do, but you can get a feel for a school by looking at all the blogs, visit a day in the life of a student. So students are applying to more and more schools because they're educating themselves more on these schools.
Kristen, I know we've also talked about the true meaning behind acceptance rates, because, even though we might see an acceptance rate between 15 and 20%, it may not really be 15 to 20% for the average kid applying. Can you explain that?
Sure, absolutely, Ann. You're 100% correct. Acceptance rates are somewhat misleading. And so for every single student that I have, I say to them, okay, you can look at that scattergram on Naviance maybe once or twice, and then we're going to put it aside, because there's a lot that goes into an acceptance rate. And students and parents can drive themselves pretty crazy by being so wedded to looking at those. So acceptance rates, one of the things that skews acceptance rates is you have to think that there are recruited athletes in those acceptance rates. There are what are considered legacies. Legacies are students of parents or grandparents who have attended that school. Some schools consider legacies just to the parent level. Some include grandparents. Some schools put a real emphasis on legacies. Some schools don't do as much. And then there's this special admit. Let's say you are an amazing in drama, and so you're accepted on that, or in band. Those are factors. Another factor you have to consider, especially when you're applying to public universities, is the acceptance rate for in-state is very different from the acceptance rate for out-of-state. Let's take an example. UVA has a published acceptance rate about 18%, but there is a state mandate in Virginia that 2/3 of the class has to come from in-state. So your in-state acceptance rate is around 28%, and your out-of-state acceptance rate is around 18%. Now, at other schools, it's even more significant a difference. At Michigan, they've got a 40% in-state acceptance rate versus a 20% out-of-state acceptance rate. So that can really skew what people think the actual acceptance rates are. And then there's something that you consider when you're considering highly selective schools. Like students apply to highly selective schools, students with rigorous programs, excellent testing, wonderful grades. And so the acceptance rate, it can also be misleading in that. Let me give you an example of that. So we have a student who has about a 1400 SAT and a 3.9 GPA. So the same student applying to two different schools. At McAllister is a small liberal arts school in Minnesota. It's an excellent school, not as super well known as other schools. They have a 32% acceptance rate, where the student is that median student is kind of in that caliber. Then you have a school like Bowdoin. Bowdoin, also an excellent smaller school in Maine. Their acceptance rate is 9%. The same student with the same GPA and SAT, and yet the acceptance rate at McAllister is that much exponentially higher. So that shows you kind of how misleading acceptance rates can be, and why we really try to caution students and parents from getting too fixated on them.
I know I've talked to so many parents over the years that say, oh, a 30% acceptance rate, my child can absolutely get into that school. But to your point, pretty much everybody that's applying is pretty qualified.
Right.
And so it's not like you're going up against kids that aren't meant to be there. They all have a shot. So that 30% is actually pretty low.
Absolutely.
So Kristen, it sounds like this all really boils down to having a strategy for applying, especially for these reach type of schools.
Absolutely.
It's different than applying to maybe a mid-tier school where you can kind of maybe put things together at the last minute. Do your best to really put your best foot forward without much thought. But when you're applying to very selective schools, that approach doesn't work at all. You have to start earlier and you need a strategy. Can you talk a little bit about that strategy? And then we'll really get into grades and coursework.
Absolutely. And it's, as you said, it's so important to have a strategy for all schools, but specifically for these highly competitive, highly selective schools. For all students, these schools, which would have acceptance rates of 10% or lower, even 15% or lower, those are considered reach schools for every single student. So it's really important to have a plan. And I was really excited to see that there were so many younger students on tonight's webinar, because starting early is one of the key components to doing that, to start setting up your strategy, your plan that can carry you through high school. So first of all, the thing that's most important is grades and your program. Nothing is going to trump your grades or your program. And so the saying I have is, having excellent grades in rigorous courses, it's not going to make you stand out, but it will at least get you in the room. And so what we say, and at EC, we do this really well, we do course mapping, which means that we start with students and we look, especially in the math and science area, that their curriculum follows a rigorous program through the years, and it has to be sequential. And so we want to see the most rigorous classes offered, whether they be IBs or APs, whatever is offered at your specific school. And even if you're a STEM kid, kids who are more into the maths and sciences, when you're applying to these really high caliber schools, you've got to have the highest level English. You want to see AP English, you want to see IB English. And then I know we've talked about this at other webinars, and it has gotten some parents quite upset about it. But when you're applying to this level of school, you want to see 4 years of a foreign language as well. So your course selection is super important when applying to these schools.
So I know that you work with kids, starting in 8th grade, and then you also have kids that come to you as juniors. How is your strategy different for those students?
So, the strategy is the same in terms of the end goal, but it varies. I had a student just this past week who is in 11th grade and is a newer student for me. And students now are going into picking their courses for next year already at the schools in Northern Virginia. They're already started this early. And they're talking about they want to go into engineering, and they weren't going to take BC calculus. And so when you want to go into engineering, that's one of the courses that you really want to see is the highest level calculus that a student can take. And so if they're younger, if they're in 8th or 9th grade, we can make sure that they have that sequential so that by the time they get to 12th grade, they'll be ready for that class. Whereas this student is in pre-calc in 11th grade. And so we're talking about the possibility of maybe taking AB over the summer so that they'll be able to take BC in the fall. But that's because this is an engineering student. I just want to make that caveat. You don't necessarily need BC calculus for all, every student doesn't need it, but if you're in a specific area. So that's an area where it's important. If we started early, we can course map through the years. And then we'll talk a little bit more about courses, especially with the electives, when we talk about crafting the narrative and how important your courses are.
One question that parents ask all the time is about AP classes or IB or dual enrollment. How many courses of this college level should kids be taking?
So they should be it's kind of a delicate balance. You want to take as many rigorous courses as you can that your student can handle and that you feel that they will do well in. So at UVA, not unusual to see students with 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 APs. But again, it's based on your school. You're always looked at what your school offers. You can't penalize a student who only has 2 APs when their school only offers 5 APs versus a school that has, 27 AP offerings. You're going to want to see a student with, 8, 9, 10, somewhere in that level AP offerings that they've taken.
Thank you for that, Kristen. We have a lot of questions rolling in. I'm going to skip over to the next slide on testing, and then let's go back to some of these questions. So we talked about grades. We talked about having rigorous coursework. What is the landscape of testing now that so many schools are test optional?
Sure. So, when the pandemic hit, about 75% of all colleges went to test optional. Since that time, about 60% have stayed test optional. And there are some schools like the UC system that have done away with testing altogether. But there are other schools who have reintroduced testing. MIT, Georgia Tech, Georgetown, Purdue. They've brought testing back into the picture. And when we're talking about highly competitive, highly selective schools, testing is very, very important. It is one of those additional factors that can differentiate you and separate you from the person next to you. And also schools are very mum about how testing kind of factors into their decision-making process. But through my research, I was able to find out that UPenn, of the 75% of early decision applicants that they accepted last year, those people submitted their test scores. And another school, Georgetown, a significant number of students who submitted their test scores were accepted than those that didn't. So testing is a factor and something that students, especially applying to these highly competitive schools, really need to prepare for, which I know here at EC, we do a really good job at doing that.
We do. And to your point that, maybe this year a college may say we're optional, but it could be, next year or the year after, it might be a different story.
Absolutely.
So we want to make sure kids are prepared. We think at Educational Connections, it is best practice for kids to take practice tests to determine their baseline and also to figure out which test they naturally score best on. Because every school in the country accepts both tests equally. They do not have favoritism. We like the SAT or the ACT. That doesn't exist. So for that reason, it's really in the child's best interest to sit for 2 practice tests. We offer these on Saturdays. They're virtual with a live proctor. You can scan the QR code here to find all of the upcoming dates and register. They're $20. And your child can sit for a test and get their score back right away. And ideally, sit for an SAT, sit for an ACT, and we can put them into a concordance table to see which test they're scoring best on. About a third of kids, it's clear they're better on one test than another. But for the other 2/3, it's really a toss-up and it comes down to personal preference. So we want kids preparing and taking the test they feel most comfortable for. So that's kind of getting started. Most students will take mock tests, usually the spring of their sophomore year, more typically the summer before their junior year, but definitely by the fall of their junior year. All right, so we talked a little bit about grades, coursework, we talked about testing. Let's kind of shift gears, Kristen, a little bit and talk about what separate kids from other applicants. Because colleges ultimately want to see the type of person you are, not just your grades or your test scores, but who you are as an individual. And that often starts with crafting a narrative. Mm-hmm. Tell us a little bit about what that narrative means and why it's so important now than ever before.
Absolutely. And it's significantly really important, Ann, when you're applying to these highly competitive, most selective schools. Because as we mentioned earlier, most of the applicants are coming with the grades, they're coming with the courses, and they're coming with the testing. So what's going to separate them from the person sitting next to them? When I was evaluating students at UVA and I would read an application, the question always in the forefront of my mind was, what makes this student, what are they passionate about? What makes them tick? What are they going to bring to my college environment, both in and out of the classroom? And the answer to that is the narrative that is crafted. And that is seen through the different components of the application. That's seen in the courses that they select to take. That's seen in how they spend their time outside of the classroom. What do they choose to do with that time? It's seen through their recommendations what people say about them, and it's seen in their essays. What they say about themselves, what their perspective in things are, what do they value, what are they passionate about? That's what you're trying to glean out of those essays and out of those recommendations. And here I can give you an example. So if we have a student, let's say, who is really interested in animals, and they think they may want to go into an animal profession, pre-vet or tech or some technician or something. And so they take the animal science class in school. And then outside of school, they volunteer at a kennel. Or they volunteer at the SPCA and they have a job at a kennel that's following a certain theme, or they take a pre-vet class at NC State that's following a narrative. It's showing a passion and an interest in something. And so especially for these highly competitive schools, they want to see a significant talent and interest in something. And that's your narrative.
I can imagine, because I know you work with all different types of kids. And I know for a fact that we send you lots of kids that you help brilliantly that have no idea what their passion is. They're not sure what they want to do. They don't know their major. Mm-hmm. What do you do when a kid kind of just comes to you feeling average?
Absolutely. And so I actually love working with those students, because I'll meet with them and I'll be like, okay, I don't really have any, I'm not really that interested in things, or I don't have any real talent. And I'll be like, and so we start delving into it. Well, what do you do with your free time? Well, I really like to crochet. I'm like, oh, you like to crochet? Well, let's talk about that. It doesn't necessarily have to be, I'm saving a third world country, or I'm president of the student body. Showing a talent and an aptitude and a passion in something and elevating that in the application is what our job is. And every student has something special and important about them, and something that we can highlight in an application. So I love getting those students.
I know our other college counselor, Lisa, and I've probably told this story before, but I just love it. She had the student, kind of similar situation. He came to her, oh, I'm just average. There's nothing great about me. And then she finds out he's won all these fly fishing tournaments, and he created this fly that he had been selling just on the side. And she encouraged him to start this Etsy store where he sold it online. And he decided to follow his passion of entrepreneurship. And it just was like this beautiful narrative. And it started with somebody who said, I'm not good at anything. So everybody has something that they're good at. That's for sure.
Everybody has something.
Yes. And I love that when kids come alive and they see that there is something special about them. All right, we're going to talk about extracurriculars in a second, but I did have a couple of questions about that parents want to have answered.
Sure.
And Pavel said, can you talk about holistic admissions, evaluating the whole person, a sincere passion or a demonstrated strong interest is paramount these days. Can you please speak about assembling the persona? So once kids have their passion, how do they go about finding those avenues that you mentioned?
Right. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about crafting a narrative. Right now, I'm busy working with my sophomores and juniors, and even a couple of freshmen right now, researching opportunities for the summer. Summer is a wonderful opportunity when students have a little bit more time to really start delving and exploring those interests and those passions. And that could be a volunteer opportunity, starting a business, taking a course either online or at a university, joining a book club. I mean, it just runs the gamut. An internship. Internships are a little harder for high school students, but there are so many opportunities out there nowadays, and it's just helping them find those things. And so we actually construct the summer and of how they spend their time. And I also am a huge proponent. You need downtime, you need fun. Those are all important things. I had a student last week with his mom, and he's like, well, I don't really have a lot of free time this summer. He comes from a dual household. And so he's got to spend time with his dad, and he's with his mom, and they both have family vacations that they're doing. And so he doesn't have a whole lot of time. So we started talking about where he was going and what he was going to do with his respective parent. And I'm like, well, that's all fascinating. We can totally use that. Students think that they have to, have these really amazing things. Yes, those are wonderful, but there are other things that we can elevate and talk about as well. Now, when you're applying to some of these highly selective schools, I have students now where they apply to summer programs that are competitive, like NIH has a summer internship program. I have a student who's applying and I'm helping them with their application now. There are programs at universities like MIT and Stanford that require applications. So, it runs the gamut from very, very highly selective programs that we can help with to just helping you find, local things in your community that you can work at. So it just runs the whole spectrum. And so that's what we're here to help the students do.
Thanks, Kristen. So that kind of lends itself to our next slide, which is all about extracurriculars. It seems that the well-rounded student, it's not that important to be so well-rounded these days. It is more important to really have that specialty, to have a passion that you follow through. Can you talk a little bit about the role of extracurriculars?
Sure, absolutely. I can't tell you how many times when I was at UVA and you get that Common App and there are 10 entries on the activities section in the Common App. And I think students sometimes feel like I got to fill out every single every single entry. And you actually don't. I'd rather see 1, 2, 3 things that the student is really involved in and passionate about than 10 things where, you went to a meeting once a week on something and you may have done this. That's just not, that's not what these highly selective schools are looking for. That old adage that we all grew up with, it's quality, not quantity, that totally holds in extracurriculars for college admissions, especially at these highly selective schools. So as we talked about, you want to see them delving in a specific area. Now, I don't want to scare parents, but for these highly selective schools, you want to see awards in these types of things or honors in these things or significant leadership opportunities that they've taken advantage of. The Bausch and Lomb Award, Rensselaer Medals, Xerox Award, College Book Awards, National Merit Semifinalists. Those are all things when you're applying to these top tier schools that you're looking to see. Like I mentioned before, these summer programs that are selective that students have to apply to. They're looking for those kinds of things as well. It doesn't mean that a student's not going to get into these schools if they don't have them, but these are things that help them set themselves apart when you're looking at these really high top tier schools.
We also know that recommendations and essays can set a student apart.
Absolutely. Definitely. I also want to mention Governor's School in Virginia. That's a really big thing. So Governor's School, boys state, girls state, scouting, those are all things that are also important. Absolutely. Recommendations and essays. This goes again to our crafting the narrative. You want your recommendations to be as robust as possible. So you, and also you want to have recommendations from most probably teachers in your 11th grade year and also in your area of interest. All these top tier schools are going to require recommendations, if not 1, 2, and sometimes they allow you to submit more. So we want students to really develop relationships with those teachers. We at EC help students craft their resumes and provide teachers with additional information about themselves so they can write that more robust recommendation. I also tell students, sometimes they're like, okay, I only have this one teacher. And then we start talking and let's say, oh, they're really involved in Taekwondo and they teach at their studio and they've been going there for 11 years. And I'm like, well, could you have your director write you a recommendation? They know you probably better than anyone and they can really talk to your leadership and your qualities outside of the classroom. So adding a recommendation from someone outside of the classroom environment is also super compelling. And then essays, we'll go back to essays. It's really important. That's where you have that opportunity to give your unique voice. I can't tell you, I think I've probably in the last 4 months reviewed maybe over 100 essays of students because especially for these top tier schools, not only do they have the Common App essay, which is that 650 word essay that goes with the Common App, but they all have supplemental essays, anywhere from 1 to even 6 supplemental essays. And sometimes students read them and they go, oh, well, this is kind of a silly question. They're asking me what my favorite book is or what my top 10 list is, or, UVA asks, what's my happy place? Those aren't frivolous questions. Those are questions trying to have the admissions evaluator understand more about who you are, what's important to you. And then we've talked about this at other webinars before, Ann, but like the why my school essay, really important. Schools sometimes disguise them in their supplemental essay, but they want to know why you want to come to their school. What contribution are you going to make to your school, to their school? What do you see there what programs you want to be involved in, and what you can provide kind of a talent to those programs. So those are really important. And we have a special strategy how we answer those.
It sounds like there's value in research and knowing what, when schools say, why do you want to come here? It can't be, I love warm weather.
Right. You've got a pretty campus.
Yeah. I like that major, but really specific things. So it sounds like research is really important.
And I think that's probably been a common theme throughout the evening that we've talked about research about opportunities, and then also researching these schools. Knowing those schools that you're applying to is important, not only from a competitive standpoint, but also in terms of compiling the college list. Here at EC, we help students compile their college list, which we like to see a balanced list. Whereas we talked about, these schools are probably all going to be reaches for all students, but we also like to see schools that are in their target area, and then schools that I call most likelies versus safeties. And it's really important that you have that balanced list. I don't let any of my students apply to a school that they wouldn't go to, because that's a waste of their time and their money to apply to these schools. So we help students compile that list, and that requires a lot of research. Research on the students' part, research on the college consultants' part as well. And it's a lot of thoughtful planning that goes into that. But there's also, like we talked about, research about the school you're applying to. So when I have students apply to schools, and when they write their essays, I make sure that they read the mission statement of the school and the letter from the dean, because that gives you insight to what's important to that school. I mean, all the schools, most things are important, but some put specific emphases on certain things. I can give you an example. Rice, excellent school in Texas, they have in their mission statement, aspire to better the world. Columbia, everybody knows Columbia, they have advanced knowledge and learning at the highest level. Two somewhat different mission statements. Rice putting a real emphasis on service, and Columbia putting a real emphasis on academia, intellectualism. And so those are things that we would, when we write the essays, or when the student writes the essays, that we make sure that we hone in on and that we touch on to show that they are a good fit for that university. And then in our research and compiling the list, we look and see, okay, is that a place that you would feel comfortable with? Is that what you want out of a college environment or a college experience? So it's twofold.
Awesome. Thank you for that. One parent just asked, at what age should you work? Do you usually work with kids? At what age do you recommend that kids come to you, ideally?
I mean, I love getting students as early as possible, because the first thing I say to them when I get a freshman or a sophomore is, we have the luxury of time, which is wonderful. So we have time to thoughtfully plan activities, what their narrative is going to be. I can help them explore, like we said, the students who say, I'm not really interested in anything. Well, that's where we help figure out what that is, what you're interested in. I mean, being a high school student is about exploration. So the earlier you come, the more time we have to explore those opportunities that are out there. But I work with students. I had a student a senior come to me in December, who had gotten deferrals and needed help applying to additional schools before the deadline. So I'll run the gamut with students.
Thank you, Kristen. Another parent asked about summer programs. How do you find out information on summer programs?
That's the beauty of the internet, is one thing. I also, just from years of experience, know that all programs are not created equal, is the other thing I want to say. I have a lot of parents who are coming to me. They've just all gotten in the mail the National Student Leadership Conference, all the materials that come from them. They do a beautiful job of marketing their program. And so not all programs are created equal. And I've been dissuading a few of my parents from focusing on that program, which is not as highly selective as they make themselves out to be, and is also inordinately expensive, where time can be spent doing other things. So it's a lot of research, and then also a lot of years of expertise in knowing what programs colleges look at and what they don't. I mean, at UVA, when we saw National Student Leadership Conference, okay, great, but it didn't hold a whole lot of water.
Kristen, let's talk a little bit about early decision and why that can be so effective and the strategy around highly selective schools.
Sure. So early decision, as people who've watched our webinars before and know that I'm a huge proponent of early decision. All three of my children went early decision. My husband and I both went early decision to the colleges we went to, but it's not right for everyone. For those people who don't know what early decision is, it's where a student applies by November 1st. They can apply to one school. It's a binding contract between the student, the parent, the guidance counselor, and the university. So if you get into the school, you have to go. It can be, and this is where research is very, very important also, some schools' early decision is a significant factor in that acceptance rate that we talked about earlier. So a school like Washington University, excellent school in St. Louis, 60% of their class is decided in their early decision round 1 and 2. Tufts, another excellent university in Boston, 50% of their class is decided in early decision. Duke takes half their class in early decision. But then there are other schools that it's not as big a factor. Princeton has this weird thing called single choice early action, which is not binding, but it's basically like an early decision without the binding component. And there isn't a real big difference between what they accept early and what they accept in regular. And then like a school like Georgetown doesn't even have early decision. So again, it requires a significant amount of research. And it's not right for everyone. But if a student determines that, I can see myself here more than anywhere else, it is something to seriously consider.
And you're right. It is a very serious consideration because it is binding, but it can make a big difference. And I know that you and Lisa and David, all the consultants with us, put a lot of time and effort into that decision with kids. And I also know that you believe that there is a college for everyone.
Absolutely. So tonight's webinar was really geared, as we talked earlier, about these really the top schools in the country, the most selective schools. So I don't want parents to get totally freaked out. We were really gearing this to those top schools. But I am a huge proponent, and I tell all my students that there is absolutely a college for everyone. There's 4,000 universities in this country, and there is a college for your student, or for, if there are students on the webinar, for you. College is what you make of it. Every single school is going to have a ton of facilities, great professors, wonderful course offerings, tons of stuff to do outside of the classroom. And so the experience is what the student makes of it. So I truly believe that, and that I hope that takes a little bit of the pressure off students to know that there really is some place for them.
Thank you for that, Kristen. It's so true. So next steps, what can parents do from here? And I want to share with you a little bit about our program, what Kristen does, and what our other consultants do, Lisa and David. We offer programs for kids starting in 8th grade. We even get a few 7th graders, but usually it's students are starting in the early part of high school. And you can learn more by going to our website, which is ectutoring.com. And then you'll see the drop down at the top for college consulting. And if you want to book an appointment to talk to Erin, she is our college consulting director. She talks to every parent that comes into our program. The college program is her baby. We have worked together for almost 13 years this summer, and this is her expertise. And she can talk to you a little bit about your child to see if what we can offer, what Kristen does, and what our other consultants do could be a match for your student. So just hold up your phone, scan the QR code, and it will take you straight to Erin's calendar. So Kristen, I see that we have lots of questions, and parents, if you have a question, please throw it into the chat. I may not get to personal questions that may just relate to your child, but things that are a little bit more comprehensive, I will do my best to get to all of those questions. So Kristen, you've been amazing. You're so full of information, and I'm extremely grateful to your expertise. And before we get to questions, I want to let everybody know that we have another webinar coming up on January 24th. It's a little bit different this one. It's helping students with ADHD plan, persist, and achieve their goals in 2023, a new year and new strategies. And I am doing that one in combination with Attitude Magazine. And you can learn more on our website at ectutoring.com/ADHD-webinar. So Kristen, I'd love to go to Q&A. And this isn't in the chat right now, but it is a question thinking about ADHD that parents have a lot. We work with many, many students that have either weak executive function skills, needing a little bit more help to be organized, to plan, to prioritize, and students with ADHD. And sometimes they're wondering, should I divulge that to a school? Should I keep that secret? Or, what should I do about that? And what do you think?
So, I mean, it really depends on the student. It depends how comfortable the student is with sharing those things about themselves. I can tell you when as UVA, when I read about a student who had academic challenges, whether it be ADHD or if they were on the spectrum, that adds a lot about a student. It adds a lot of color. It shows perseverance. It shows that they're really up for a challenge. And that's really important. So I actually, right now, I have numerous students with ADHD. I have a couple of students who are actually on the spectrum as well. And we address that in the additional information section of the Common App. I had one student who actually used it at his main essay in the Common App. But for the other students, we talked about it in the additional information area. And it's something to be proud of. And I actually see it as a plus to elevate in an application.
Awesome. Thank you for that, Kristen. All right. So let's go to the chat. Let's see. Okay. How do you, well, this is kind of the same thing. How do you support kids that have learning differences in the application? I would assume it's pretty much like ADHD.
Yes.
Even though a learning disability and ADHD are different, you can divulge that, and families and kids can share their experiences, because I have to think it's kind of compelling to overcome these obstacles.
Absolutely.
All right. Thank you for that, Jamie. And then Jennifer asks, how much do services cost? It's on our website. You can see that on our website. Cindy asks, what about diversity? What are your thoughts on highlighting diversity? In our case, my child is Native American. Should that be in essays, or should we talk about this in other ways?
I think diversity comes in many different forms. There's diversity in color, sexual orientation, in ideas, and I think if a student has that, I think it's important to elevate. I think it sets a student apart. As I said to you, when I was reading an application at UVA, I'm looking to see what is a student going to bring to my community, and also what separates them from the person sitting next to them. So diversity is a big proponent of that. If you are Native American, I suggest making, if you have your tribal number, that is something you can put actually on the common application, and it's really important to put it there. So I have one student who was Native American heritage this past year. I had her have her mother track down her grandmother to go to the chief and get their tribal number, because it's important. It shows a different perspective, and it's something we wanted to elevate.
Wow, that's really interesting. I never thought about a tribal number, but that's really awesome. Thank you for sharing that, Kristen. Juliana asks, can you talk about community service and how that plays into decisions? For a student who is deeply involved in a specific extracurricular, say singing and theater, there is limited time to do significant community service, but they may be doing service within that realm, volunteering to build a set, mentoring younger theater students. Is it best to stay within their interests for community service, or look to find an additional community service aligned with another interest they may have?
That's a great question. Community service, I'm a huge proponent of community service. Whenever I read an application at UVA, I wanted to see that a student was giving back to a community in some form. That could be the community of their drama group. That could be at their community at large, at their food bank. So it's really how you craft that and how you speak about that. I just want to see that a student is looking outside of themselves and giving back to a community, and that community can take lots of different definitions.
Thank you. Randy asks, do you work with twice exceptional students or have any particular recommendations?
With twice exceptional?
So, yeah, twice exceptional students. So students who are gifted and also may have a learning disability, or ADHD and gifted. Oh,
I have a bunch of those this year. I actually have never heard that that terminology. That, yes, absolutely. In fact, those are some of the most wonderful students because they're really, really interesting. And yes, absolutely.
Okay, great. What do you do, Jennifer asks, if your student had a bad semester in school? How can you overcome that?
Yeah, it happens. Life happens. And so that's where this additional information section can really be important. If the student has a bad semester or even a bad year, but they show an upwards trajectory, that's super compelling. And I have a number of students who have had significant challenges in different times in their high school career. And we literally address it honestly and forthright in the additional information section. And, that's what we do. And it's, especially if they show an improvement, it can be really compelling.
Sherry asks, does UVA or colleges in general, do they prefer IB or AP, or maybe it doesn't matter?
It really doesn't matter. It depends on the offering at your school. I suggest that parents look at their school profile. It's called the SSR. It's the secondary school report. Whenever college admissions office is looking at an application, they also have the secondary school report, and it shows the highest level courses offered at that school. It shows how they're weighted. Some schools offer honors at a certain different weight as they offer APs. DEs at certain schools, dual enrollments, are handled differently at some schools versus others. At some schools, they're equivalent to an AP. At other schools, they're a little lower than an AP. So we follow, when you're reading an application and determining the rigor of the program, we follow how the school deals with those courses. So I recommend that you get your school's SSR and take a look at it.
Carol says, during our school visits, many admissions folks suggested reaching calculus, but not specifically AP Calc. Is that something you think is critical, even for non-STEM students?
No, I went to law school because I'm terrible at math. So, it just happens. There are some students who are just not great at math. So I think if you get through your years of math as best you can to the highest level rigor that you think you can do by still doing well in it. And then you can supplement it with having more rigorous classes in other areas.
Pavel says, can you talk about summer programs for middle schoolers? Like he says Exeter versus Andover versus Tufts versus CTY. How do you know what is compelling to a college or a university?
For middle school?
Mm-hmm.
So, okay, what students do in middle school is not addressed on your college application. So it's really what you do in high school on. What you do in middle school is interesting in how it can set you up for what you do in high school. So in middle school, this is a time, especially where I say we have the luxury of time, and that's to explore. See what your child is interested in. If they don't know if they're interested, if they show even a teeny bit of interest in a certain area, then I would pursue it. Or if they, let's say they love cooking. So you sign them up for a cooking class. That could lead to something else. They could be, find a club, start a club at their school with regards to cooking, or working with a food bank or something of that nature. Middle school, to me, is a time of exploration.
Awesome. Thank you. Judy says, my child is volunteering in our Asian community as he can relate to it. Can that be evaluated proudly in the essay, or should he try to diversify and reach out to other communities in his volunteering work?
I think it's really important that students embrace their heritage, whatever it is. So, and it's also, students need to be authentic. It's going to come through in an application. So if your student, if your child is really loving the work that he's doing in his Asian community, by all means, continue with that and elevate it in the application, because that authenticity and their passion is going to come through on their essays. If they're doing things contrived just because they think it's going to look good on an application, evaluators have seen every type of student, and sometimes they can see through that. So I say, have your student, follow their passions, do what they want organically and authentically, because also, yes, it's really important where they go to, they think it's really important where they go to college, but they also, this is their high school experience, this is their life, and it should be rich and it should be enjoyable in whatever they do.
This parent wants to know if you could talk about specialized SAT tests that are required at many selective schools. I don't know if he's talking about subject tests, which
Or not.
we don't have those anymore. Do you know of other tests?
I do not. No.
Okay. I'm not sure. There used to be subject tests. The
Yep.
SAT, the College Board, which writes the SAT, used to also have subject tests that a lot of very selective schools wanted. Georgetown was actually the last holdout, but they've went away a few years ago. So there are no other
I wonder if he's talking about
SAT tests.
AP exams, maybe.
Oh, maybe. But this parent, KP, if you want to email me, Ann at EC Tutoring, I can help figure out what tests they are, and Kristen and I can talk about it and get back to you. Victoria asks, is there an impact of private high school versus public high school on admissions?
I mean, not private versus public. I mean, there's no holds about it. Your student is going to be evaluated by the peers in their school. No question. Most of these schools, these highly selective schools, these students have to be in the top 1% to 3% of their class. Some schools have class rankings, some don't, but they need to be in the top 1% to 3% of their class. And they need to be in roughly the 95% of test takers on the SAT, which right now is falling around 1460 on the SAT and 34 on the ACT. But so public versus private, not as big an issue, but being compared to your peers within your school is really what's important.
Another factor is that the reader, the admissions person who's evaluating the child's application, also evaluates all the other kids in that school. Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. When I first started at UVA, we actually didn't evaluate students by region, but it became, after a few years that I was there, that you actually read by region and you actually read by high school. So you would read, you would evaluate all the students from that high school in a block. So you could literally compare them with one another by their program, by what their grades were, by where they fell in their class academically. So that's how you read regionally, and I think most universities do that at this point.
Laura says our school no longer offers AP classes. How many AP tests should the student take? Should the student take the AP test even if he doesn't take the class?
I mean, that's a personal preference. You cannot be penalized for not taking a rigorous course if it's not offered at your school. When I worked at UVA, I read down in Appalachia, and the students there were no APs. There were no opportunities for advanced classes. Couldn't penalize a student for that. That it just wasn't offered at their school. And so it's really by what you're evaluated against what the offerings are at your school, which is why I suggest parents and students look at their school profile and the course offerings.
Kelly and Leslie want to know if you have an opinion about the AP Capstone program and whether it gives kids a particular advantage in their application.
I mean, the AP Capstone program is a wonderful program. For those who don't know, it's a combination of an AP seminar class and an AP research class. You take one in 11th and one in 12th. It's a rigorous class. It's considered it's 2 APs. And if your student is interested in it, by all means, take it. If they're not interested in it, there are other offerings that are just as rigorous.
How do colleges evaluate class rank? You mentioned that earlier. Does every high school provide a class rank? And how seriously is that taken by colleges? That is from Bang.
Absolutely. A lot of schools don't, I would say more schools than not, don't supply a class rank. And so, as I said, when you're evaluating a school, you're evaluating all the applicants who apply from a school, you can see where they fall within their class. And you also have historical data of where students fall in their GPAs within a class. And so that's how they kind of you figure out where they fall like percentage wise in the class. So for these highly selective schools, students need to be in what's considered the first decile, the top 10%, but it's gotten to a point now where it's even in the top 1 to 3, 1 to 5%, depending on the school.
Kathy asks, is geographic diversity important to colleges?
It can be. If you're from North Dakota, that's wonderful. So it can be, but it's not necessarily a huge factor for a lot of schools. Obviously, every school wants to say, we have a representative from a student from every 50 states and from 40 countries. But for most of us and most of our audience, we're in Virginia, and Virginia is not necessarily a geographic diverse environment.
Sarah asks, do post-AP courses weigh heavily over AP courses?
Well, yes. I mean, post-AP is just what it is. It's courses beyond the AP level. And so absolutely, if your student is one that has gotten in a particular subject, that they've gotten through multivariable calculus per se, and then they've gone into differential equations or linear algebra, which is considered a post-AP, that's definitely counted. Sometimes computer science students, they've taken the AP computer science and computer science principles. And so now they're in what's considered advanced computer science. That's a post-AP. If your student goes to Thomas Jefferson High School, they offer a ton of post-APs. And so, yes, absolutely. Those are really highly considered at these top universities.
This is also from a TJ parent. She says, a local governor's school, TJ, if the student is top 30%, do colleges consider that as a magnet school, or how do they treat kids from TJ compared to other schools?
So TJ is a little bit of in a class by itself. It is a highly, highly competitive high school, one of the best high schools in the country. And so it is addressed accordingly. So students there take incredible programs, well into those the post APs and AP classes. And so universities do know that and do see that. And so they may dive a little deeper into a school like that. And maybe not just to the top 3%, but maybe the top 10% or depending on the school because of that high caliber high school.
Do you think that colleges will start to consider coding in replacement of a foreign language? This mom is asking for her dyslexic son.
It's a really interesting question. I don't know the answer to that. I think that's really interesting. That if they don't, they should. I mean, they also American Sign Language is considered a foreign language. I mean, considered a language and is included. So that's interesting.
Carol says, what's your recommendation for the amount of time kids should prepare for a test? Like should they start in January for a March test? Or I can answer that, Kristen, if you prefer.
No, go right ahead.
Okay, so it really depends on what their baseline score is and what the score is that they're looking to achieve. So the wider the gap, the longer that they're going to need to prepare. Sometimes we get kids that are super accomplished right out of the gate, and they're applying to highly selective schools, but they're already at a very top score. They may not need as much time. Whereas students starting at a lower score and want to get a higher, they may need longer. But in general, it's about 3 months of preparation. There are weekly sessions. The kids meet with their tutor once a week, and then they can expect about an hour and a half of homework. And we used to do boot camps where we concentrated the sessions into, a very short period of time, like a weekend or a week. And when we looked at the results, the tutoring one-to-one every week over a longer period of time far outweighed the score gains from boot camp type of thing. So I think that really having somebody one-to-one who can specifically work on your child's areas of weakness, because that's how you improve your score the most, is looking for those weaknesses, improving those, rather than like a holistic view or also working on the high scoring part. For kids that are already good test takers, that is really the magic to get them to increase their score. Let's see. I understand that Fairfax County Public Schools, we're already over time. You know what? Let me just ask this one question and then we'll stop. I understand that they might start accept coding in lieu of a foreign language for an advanced diploma. It's worth exploring, and I hope other school districts will consider that as well. Yes, Randy, that's wonderful. That
That
seems
is
great to
amazing.
me. So thank you for your comment. Kristen, thank you so much. Sorry we're over time, everybody. It was really wonderful to have you on this evening. And I hope that you come back and share your expertise with us once again. It was a real pleasure.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us this evening, and we will see you soon. And oh, don't forget, there is a survey that will pop up at the end of this webinar. If you would be so kind to answer the questions that will help us prepare for our next event. Have a great evening, everybody, and bye-bye.